Alright, now we proceed with our third part, that is journalizing. So again, we will first define what is a journal. Journal is the book of original entry because this is the first record of the business transaction. It is a chronological record of business transactions in terms of debit and credit. So what are the contents of journal? So we have the date, the account titles and explanation, the posting reference, and of course, the very important, debit and credit. So we apply it to the business transactions of Angat Buhay Designs. On July 5, computer equipment costing 145,000 pesos is acquired on cash from Abenson. So what is the steps to be taken? First step is to determine what dual accounts are affected by the transaction. Is it an asset, liability, or capital? Second step, identify the normal balance accounts affected. So first step, determine the dual accounts. First account affected is computer equipment. So that is an asset. Second account affected is cash, another asset. So asset affected, there's an increase. Increase in asset. What is the normal balance of asset? The normal balance of asset is debit. So we acquired a computer equipment. So there's an increase in asset. That increase is computer equipment. But also, take note that there's a payment of cash. So there's a reduction of cash. So we will also credit cash 145,000 pesos. Next transaction. July 9, computer supplies worth 25,000 pesos were purchased on account. Purchased on account meaning no payment. If there's no payment, there is a liability. Again, what is the normal balance of liability? Liability's normal balance is credit. That's why you will credit accounts payable worth 25,000 pesos. And what is the corresponding asset? Computer supplies. What is the normal balance of asset? Debit. That's why we will debit computer supplies. So what is the corresponding credit? Increase in liability. The normal balance of liability is credit. That's why you will credit accounts payable. Okay, so next transaction. July 11, Angat Buhay Designs collected 88,000 pesos in cash for designing interactive websites for Daryl Yap's Made in Malacanang online movie promotions. So, dual accounts affected. First account affected is cash because there's a collection. What's the second account affected? Revenue because there's a rendition of service for the designing of interactive websites. So, we will determine next is the normal balance. What's the normal balance of asset? Debit. So we will debit cash. So what is the normal balance of revenue? Normal balance of revenue is credit. So we will debit revenue 88,000 pesos. Again, always maintain that the debit and credit must always be equal. Next transaction, July 16. Robredo paid its Meralco and internet bills amounting to 18,000 pesos to Remulla Express. First step, determine the dual accounts affected. First account affected, cash because there's a payment amounting to 18,000. Then internet bills. So, internet bills can be classified as utilities expense. What is the normal balance of expense? Normal balance of expense is debit. So here, we will debit utilities expense amounting to 18,000 pesos. So, the next question is, what is the corresponding credit? So, there's a reduction in cash. If you reduce cash, you will have it credited. Why credit? Because it's the opposite of debit. Next question, transaction, July 17. Angat Buhay Designs has service contract with various social media personalities, Kumu artists and TikTokerists to maintain their websites regularly. The business charged these clients 35,000 pesos for website maintenance services for July. So, first step, dual accounts affected. First account affected, revenue. So, revenue because there's a contract with the service clients. Then, here, no mention about cash collection. If there's no cash collection, we will debit it to accounts receivable. Why debit? Because there's an increase in asset, accounts receivable. So, what is the corresponding credit? Revenue. But what is the normal balance of revenue? The normal balance of revenue is credit. So, if we have accounts receivable debit of 35,000 pesos, it will be balanced by service revenue, same amount. Next transaction, July 19. Robredo made a partial payment of 17,000 pesos for the July 9 purchase of computer supplies on account. So here, there's a partial payment. So that account is affected. The first account affected is cash, the reduction because of the partial payment. The second account affected is accounts payable. What will happen to the accounts payable? The accounts payable will be reduced because of the payment. What is the normal balance of liability? The normal balance of liability is credit. But in this transaction, it will be debited because of the reduction as a result of the payment of cash. So here, we will debit accounts payable and a credit of 17,000 pesos to cash. Next transaction, July 20. Checks amounting to 25,000 pesos were received from clients for billings dated July 17, 2022. So, first account affected is cash because there's a collection. What is the second account affected? So, there's already a billing dated July 17, but the collection was made on July 2020. So, if there's a collection, what will happen to the account receivable? The account receivable will decrease. If there's a reduction in asset, the reduction in asset will be recorded by credit. So, there will be a credit to accounts receivable. So, what is the corresponding debit? The debit should be on cash. Why? Because there's a collection. Okay, next transaction. July 21, Robredo withdrew 20,000 pesos from the business for her personal use to buy a brand new TCL aircon converter for her house in Cavite. First account affected, of course, cash because there's a withdrawal. Second account affected, Robredo drawings because there's a reduction in capital. So what is the normal balance of asset? Debit. But here, there's a reduction in asset, so there should be a credit. Credit to cash, debit to Robredo drawings. Last transaction, July 31. Robredo paid Philip D. her assistant designer salaries, 15,000 pesos for the month of July. So the payment of salary. So there's a reduction of asset, cash, and also a expense, salaries. What is the normal balance of expense? Normal balance of expense is debit. So we will debit salaries. What is the normal balance of asset? Normal balance of asset is debit. But in this transaction, there's a reduction because of the payment of salary. So we will credit cash of 15,000 pesos. Again, debit and credit should always be equal. Okay, next topic is the comparison of journal entry versus the worksheet. Here, the journal entry, the debit and credit must always be equal. Versus the worksheet wherein the assets and the liabilities and capital must always be the same or equal. So as you can see, July 9, computer supplies, accounts payable, debit, credit, the same. In the worksheet, assets, 25,000 supplies, liabilities, 25,000 pesos. Next transaction, July 11. Again, the golden rule, debit and credit must always be the same in the journal entry. Whereas in the worksheet, the accounting equation must always be the same or equal. Same goes with other transactions. On July 16, the utilities expense, debit of 18,000, credit of 18,000. Debit and credit always the same. That is the golden rule. Worksheet, accounting equation always the same. Asset is always the same with the liabilities and capital. Same goes with the transaction on July 17, the provision for service revenue, and then the setting up of accounts receivable, debit of 35,000 for accounts receivable, credit for service revenue. Again, always the same, debit and credit always equal. Same goes with the worksheet, assets is always equal to the liabilities and capital. Next transaction, July 19, partial payment, so there's a reduction of cash. Reduction in cash is recorded under credit. And the payment of liability, so there's a debit of 17,000 pesos to accounts payable. Always the same, golden rule, debit and credit always the same. Next transaction, July 20, collection of receivable, so there's a cash debit of 25,000 and a corresponding credit of 25,000 pesos for the accounts receivable. Next transaction, July 21. This is withdrawal of investment of capital by the owner, Robredo. And of course, a reduction in cash. So debit, Robredo drawings, 20,000 pesos, credit cash. Debit and credit always the same. In the worksheet, accounting equation must always be equal or the same. Then the last transaction, the July 31. Salary expense, debit, credit to cash, 15,000 pesos. Okay, so we now proceed with the actual experiences from outside real world. Remember the golden rule. Debit and credit must always be the same, and we will always maintain the equality of the accounting equation. Thank you. Please like and subscribe.